The Vakari Dominion had conquered 43 star systems in 11 years. They did it the same way every time. Find the weakest point, apply pressure, watch it crumble. Station Omega-7 looked like the weakest point humanity had. It hung at the edge of the Kepler belt like a forgotten tooth, old, scarred, and alone. Its hull was patchwork metal, marked by decades of micro-impact damage. Its signal output was weak, almost embarrassingly so. Long-range Vakari probes showed a skeleton crew of maybe 200 humans. Minimal weapon signatures. A single docking ring. 3 outdated point defense turrets that hadn't been upgraded in what their intelligence suggested was 15 years. Fleet Commander Vos Karath studied the holographic display of the station from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, surrounded by a battle group of 60 warships. "This is what stands between us and the inner colonies," he said. His second-in-command, Sub-Commander Dreth, tilted his head. "Humans placed it here strategically. It controls the only stable jump corridor into their Kepler colonies." "Then it is a gate," Vos Karath said, "and gates can be broken." He wasn't wrong about that. What he was wrong about, catastrophically, historically, fatally wrong about, was what the gate was actually for, because Station Omega-7 wasn't guarding the corridor. It was the corridor. 3 days before the Vakari fleet arrived, a woman named Admiral Sarah Voss sat alone in Omega-7's command center and drank terrible coffee. She was 54 years old. She had short gray hair, a prosthetic left hand from a skirmish she never talked about, and the kind of patience that only comes from spending 20 years thinking about one problem. She had been thinking about the Vakari for 20 years. Her staff moved quietly around her. They had stopped asking her questions 2 days ago. They knew what was coming. They knew their jobs. Every single person on this station, all 212 of them, had volunteered for this assignment knowing exactly what it meant. Not one of them had hesitated. Lieutenant Commander Reyes appeared at her elbow. 29 years old, brilliant, terrifyingly calm. "Vakari fleet just crossed the outer marker, Admiral. 61 ships. They brought a siege formation." Voss nodded slowly. They did their homework. "Their lead ship is broadcasting a demand for immediate surrender." She looked at the message on the screen. It was thorough. She had to give them that. Precise terms. A deadline of 6 hours. A detailed list of what would happen to the station and its crew if the deadline was not met. She set down her coffee. "Send them our response." Reyes almost smiled. "The standard one?" "The standard one." The message that went out to Fleet Commander Vos Karath was 3 words long. "Come and take it." On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Vos Karath read the message twice. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried genuine amusement. He had expected fear, pleading perhaps, an attempt to negotiate. 3 words. "Brave," Dreth said carefully. "Foolish," Vos Karath replied. "Begin the siege formation, standard approach. I want that station intact enough to use as a forward base." He paused. "Do not underestimate the humans. They are stubborn. But stubborn is not the same as capable." He would think about that distinction a great deal in the days that followed. The Vakari fleet moved in like a closing fist, 61 ships arranging themselves in a perfect sphere around Omega-7, cutting off every approach vector, every escape route, every possible avenue of reinforcement. It was textbook siege doctrine. It had worked 43 times before. What none of their scans picked up, what no Vakari sensor in the fleet detected, was the 240 kilometers of dormant hardware sleeping in the asteroid field surrounding the station. Cold, unpowered, invisible, waiting. Admiral Voss watched the fleet lock into position on her display and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not even anticipation. Satisfaction. "They're in," Reyes said quietly. "Yes," she said. "They are." She picked up her coffee again and took a long, slow sip. "Now we close the door." The first 6 hours of the siege went exactly as Vos Karath expected. He sent precision fire at Omega-7's point defense turrets. All 3 were destroyed within the first 40 minutes. The humans made no attempt to repair or replace them. He took this as a sign of limited resources. He was right about that. He was wrong about what it meant. He attempted to jam the station's communications. The jamming worked perfectly. No signals in, no signals out. He took this as successful isolation of the target. He was right about that too. What he did not understand, what his entire fleet did not understand, was that Omega-7 didn't need to communicate with anyone. Everything Admiral Voss needed was already here. Had been here for 2 years, placed carefully, quietly, without ceremony, by a construction project officially listed in Earth's military budget as Belt Infrastructure Maintenance, Kepler Sector. Nobody reads budget line items. The Vakari certainly hadn't. At hour 7, Voss-Karath made his first serious move. He detached 12 ships from the sphere formation and sent them forward to begin hull-breaching operations, the standard method for taking a station intact. Specialized ships that would anchor to the hull, cut through it, and deliver boarding parties directly into the interior. The 12 ships crossed the 40,000-kilometer threshold. Nothing happened. They crossed the 20,000-kilometer threshold. Still nothing. Voss-Karath watched with something approaching satisfaction. The humans were simply going to let them come. Perhaps they had accepted the inevitable. Perhaps, at 8,000 kilometers, the asteroid field woke up, not all at once. That was the first thing that made it terrifying. It didn't explode into action like a panicked defense. It was systematic, methodical. The way a professional does a job. The first thing the Vakari ships saw on their sensors was mass. Hundreds of objects, previously registering as inert rock, now emitting power signatures, drive signatures, weapon signatures. What? Dreth began. The first rail strike hit a Vakari cruiser at 47 kilometers per second. The cruiser did not survive. In 30 seconds, 4 of the 12 advanced ships were destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled, destroyed. Hit by kinetic impactors moving so fast that the ship's shields had no meaningful time to respond. The other 8 broke formation immediately, scattering back toward the main fleet. 2 more were hit during the retreat. 6 ships returned out of 12. In 30 seconds, the bridge of the Eternal Dominion was very quiet. Report, Voss-Karath said, his voice completely flat. The tactical officer's hands were moving fast across his console. The asteroid field is not an asteroid field, Commander. The objects are artificial, disguised as rock. We count. A pause. A long pause. We count over 400 individual units. Mixed weapons platforms, railguns, missile batteries, point defense clusters. Another pause. And something else. Something we don't have a classification for. Show me. The display updated. Scattered throughout the field were larger objects, still disguised as asteroids, but now that the fleet sensors were actively looking, clearly artificial. Long, cylindrical, heavily armored. What are those? Dreth asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Inside Omega-7, Lieutenant Commander Reyes looked at Admiral Voss. They've identified the hammers. How many? Best guess, they can see about 30% of them. Voss nodded. Good, let them look. Voss-Karath spent 2 hours reorganizing his thinking. He was a methodical man. It was his greatest strength, and though he didn't know it yet, his greatest weakness in this particular situation. He understood the trap intellectually. This station was bait. The field was the real defense, and humanity had spent considerable time and resources building it without his intelligence services noticing. He respected that. He even admired it slightly. But he still had 61 ships, now 55. And they were still in siege formation around a station with 200 people on it. His weapons outranged most of what the field had shown him. He had options. What he decided to do was methodical, calculated, and completely reasonable given the information he had. He pulled his fleet back to 80,000 kilometers and began long-range bombardment of the weapons platforms, picking them off one by one from outside their effective range. It worked. For 40 minutes it worked beautifully. 14 platforms destroyed, minimal return fire, no Vakari casualties. Then Admiral Voss activated the second layer. There is a concept in human military history called a defense in depth. It means you don't put all your strength at one line. You put strength everywhere, layered, so that when an enemy breaks through one line, they find another line waiting, and then another until they are deep inside your territory, exhausted and surrounded, and they realize too late that they were never breaching a defense. They were walking into a stomach. The second layer of Omega-7's trap was not in the asteroid field, it was under it. 56 autonomous combat drones, each the size of a large ground vehicle, had been anchored to asteroids at the very bottom of the field, too deep for Vakari long-range sensors to detect clearly. They were not disguised as rock. They were simply small, cold, and patient. When Voskareth pulled his fleet back to 80,000 kilometers to begin long-range bombardment, he unknowingly repositioned his ships into the drone's optimal engagement range. The drones launched, not at the warships, at the engines. 4 Vakari capital ships lost engine capability in the first drone wave. They didn't explode. The drones were designed to disable, not destroy. An exploding ship is gone. A disabled ship stays in place, and a disabled ship in a battle zone is a problem for every other ship around it. Voskareth found himself managing a tactical nightmare. 51 combat-capable ships, 4 drifting hulks, waves of drones targeting his propulsion systems, and an asteroid field full of railguns that punished any ship that came within 30,000 kilometers of the station. He was still winning on paper. He still had more firepower than anything in front of him, but he was no longer controlling the tempo of the battle. Admiral Voss was. She sat in the command center of Omega-7 and watched the Vakari fleet with the detached focus of someone who had planned this engagement in simulation roughly 1,200 times. She had run every version. Every response the Vakari commander could make she had modeled. Every adaptation, every tactical adjustment. There was one move she was waiting for. Reyes appeared beside her. He's pulling the fleet into a tighter formation, concentrating firepower to punch through the field in a single corridor. There it is, Voss said quietly. Should I activate the hammers? She looked at the display for a long moment. The Vakari fleet was compressing, ships moving closer together, presenting a concentrated mass of firepower. It was the correct move given their information. It was what she would have done. It was also exactly what the hammers were built for. Not yet, she said. Let them commit. Voskareth committed everything to the corridor push. It was a good plan. A focused burn through a single gap in the weapons field, overwhelming the platforms in that sector through sheer volume of fire, then pushing the fleet through the gap to close engagement range where the station's lack of point defense would be decisive. He assembled 43 of his best ships into a tight spear formation and drove it at Omega-7's northern approach at maximum combat speed. The platforms in that sector returned fire. Some were destroyed. The Vakari fleet pushed through, taking hits, losing 2 more ships but pushing through. They were 25,000 kilometers from Omega-7 when the hammers fired. The hammers were officially designated as Kinetic Delivery Systems, Long-Range Autonomous, KDSLA in Earth's procurement documents. They were large because they had to be. The projectiles they launched were not missiles. They were not energy weapons. They were solid tungsten rods, 2 meters in diameter, 12 meters long, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light through a magnetic launch tube 4 kilometers long. Each rod carried no explosives. It didn't need any. Physics did the work. The first hammer fired at a Vakari battlecruiser at the center of the spear formation. The targeting solution had been calculated 6 minutes earlier. The rod crossed the distance in 0.4 seconds. At that velocity, the impact energy was approximately equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. The battlecruiser ceased to exist. In the next 11 seconds, 7 more hammers fired. Each one had been pre-targeted based on the fleet's predicted position during the corridor push, positions that Voss's methodical, predictable tactics had delivered with almost perfect accuracy. 8 ships. Gone. Not destroyed in the conventional sense. Simply struck by physics so violent that the word destroyed felt inadequate. The Vakari spear formation broke apart. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, an alarm was sounding that Voskareth had never heard in combat before. He had heard it in training simulations. It was the mass casualty alert. triggered when sensor systems detected the simultaneous destruction of multiple capital ships. "Report," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "8 vessels lost, Commander. The weapons that hit them." The tactical officer stopped. "Report," Voskareth said again. "We have no countermeasure for what hit them. The projectiles moved too fast for our point defense to engage. We had less than half a second of warning." A pause. "We believe there are more of those weapons in the field. We cannot determine how many." Voskareth looked at the display. He had arrived with 61 ships. He had 43 combat-capable vessels remaining. He had been here for 11 hours. He had not reached the station. For the first time in his career, Fleet Commander Voskareth felt something he didn't have a word for in his language. Humans would have called it the specific, stomach-dropping feeling of realizing you have been completely, thoroughly, expertly outplayed. "Options," he said. Silence. "Someone give me options." Dreth spoke carefully. "We can attempt to withdraw through the corridor we entered on." Voskareth looked at him. Then he looked at the display. The entry corridor. The one his fleet had come through when the field was dormant and silent and pretending to be empty space. "Is the entry corridor clear?" he asked the tactical officer. A long pause. "No, Commander. The platforms have repositioned. The entry corridor is covered." Of course it was. Admiral Sarah Voss had one rule about traps. A trap that kills everything in it is a weapon. A trap that demonstrates something is a message. And humanity, at this particular moment in its relationship with the Vakari Dominion, needed to send a message far more than it needed 43 more destroyed ships. She opened a communication channel to the Vakari fleet. It took them 6 minutes to respond. She waited. She was good at waiting. When Voskareth's face appeared on her screen, she studied him carefully. He was composed. Whatever he was feeling, he had put it somewhere internal and locked it away. She respected that. "Admiral," he said. His translation unit rendered the word precisely. "Commander," she said, "I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say it once, and I need you to bring it home to the people who sent you." He said nothing. She took that as permission to continue. "You have 43 ships," she said. "You entered this system with 61. You have been here 11 hours and you have not come within 8,000 kilometers of this station." She let that sit. "I have enough hammers left in this field to destroy every ship you have remaining. You cannot see them all. You cannot target them all. Your point defense cannot stop them." Another pause. "I want you to understand that I have not fired those hammers. That is a choice I am making right now, in this moment." Voskareth's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to go home," Voss said simply. "I want you to tell the Dominion what happened here. I want you to describe this station, this field, these weapons. I want you to be honest about the numbers." She leaned forward slightly. "And I want you to understand that this is not our most defended position. This is a station we built specifically for you to attack. Everything you see here, the platforms, the drones, the hammers, we built it knowing you were coming, knowing what formation you would use, knowing what tactics you would employ." She let him think about that. "We have been watching you for a long time, Commander. You conquer through predictability. You find the weak point and you push. You have done it 43 times, and it has always worked." She sat back. "It worked here too. We gave you a weak point. You found it. You pushed." A pause. "And now you're inside a trap that was built 2 years ago to hold exactly 61 ships." Voskareth was quiet for a very long time. "You let us in," he said finally. "Not a question." "We invited you in," Voss corrected. "There's a difference. What happened next would be studied in Vakari military academies for decades." Voskareth, to his considerable credit, did not make additional tactical errors. He did not attempt a desperate assault. He did not call Voss's bluff, correctly understanding that there was no bluff to call. He issued a fleet-wide order, gathered his 43 remaining ships into a careful formation, and began a slow, methodical withdrawal through the one corridor the Hammers had left open. Because of course Voss had left a corridor open. She had planned for that too. As the Vakari fleet retreated, every surviving ship passed within clear visual sensor range of something that had been invisible during the approach. Attached to the outer hull of Omega-7, clearly visible now, were markers. Plaques. 43 of them, each one etched with the name and designation of a Vakari warship that had attacked a human target in the previous 11 years. None of those ships had survived their engagements. Every single Vakari captain who passed the station saw their fleet's history written on its hull and understood what they were looking at. A monument, not to victory, to memory, to the meticulous, patient 20-year project of a species that did not forget, did not rush, and did not build traps until the trap was perfect. The last Vakari ship cleared the outer marker at 14:32 station time. Admiral Voss's staff erupted. Not the kind of explosion that comes from adrenaline and relief, though that was part of it. It was the release of 2 years of preparation, of everyone on the station living with the knowledge of what they were here to do and simply waiting, day after day, to do it. Reyes was grinning so hard it looked like it hurt. 43 ships withdrew, 0 pursuit capability. Their fleet won't be reformed for at least 8 months. Good, Voss said. Should I send the after-action report to command? Give me an hour. She stood up, stretching. I want to write the summary personally. She walked to the observation window. A small thing, really. Just a strip of reinforced glass along one wall of the command center. She looked out at the asteroid field, which had gone quiet again. Platforms powering back down. Drones returning to anchor positions. To a passing ship, it would look like an empty, unremarkable belt of rock. That was the point. She thought about the message she was going to write to Earth Command. She had been composing it in her head for 2 years, adjusting it, refining it. She knew what the first line would be. They came. They saw exactly what we wanted them to see. They did exactly what we expected them to do. The station held. She thought about the 43 plaques on the hull outside. She thought about the Vakari captains who had read them. She thought about the report that Voss Kareth was writing right now, on the retreating flagship, and what it was going to say, and who was going to read it. Good. She wanted them to read it. She wanted every fleet commander in the Dominion to read it, and to sit with it, and to think about what it meant when a species doesn't react to you, doesn't panic, doesn't scramble, just watches you, studies you, builds something specific and patient and invisible and waits. Waits as long as it takes. The Vakari had conquered 43 star systems by finding the weak point. Today they had learned something important. Sometimes the weak point finds you. 3 months later, the Vakari Dominion submitted a formal request for diplomatic negotiations with the Terran Republic. The delegation arrived at Earth with a full honor guard and no weapons. The negotiations were held at a location of humanity's choosing, Station Omega-7. The Valdris Imperium had conquered 412 worlds. Not metaphorically, not diplomatically. 412 civilizations had looked up at their skies, seen the shadow of the Imperial Armada blotting out their suns, and within a standard galactic cycle, submitted, surrendered, or ceased to exist entirely. The math was simple. The Valdris didn't negotiate. They calculated. They had war models older than most species' written languages. They had predictive algorithms that could simulate the military response of any civilization within a margin of error so small it was essentially zero. They fed a species biology, population density, resource output, territorial instinct, and technological threshold into the Dominion engine. And it told them exactly how long the war would take, how many casualties they would absorb, and what the optimal extraction rate of the conquered world would be post-pacification. In 412 conquests, the Dominion engine had never been wrong, not once. So when the Valdris turned their expansion vector toward a small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm, a world the locals called Earth, Supreme Executor Valdorn fed the data into the engine with the casual indifference of a man signing paperwork. The humans were young, barely 6,000 years of recorded civilization. Their fastest ships couldn't break past the edge of their own solar system with any reliable consistency. Their weapons were kinetic-based, chemically propelled, laughably primitive by imperial standards. They had no unified planetary government. They were still fractured into hundreds of squabbling nation-states. The engine processed, calculated, rendered. Projected pacification timeline, 14 standard cycles. Projected imperial casualties, 0.003% of deployed force. Recommended force deployment, 2 Dominion battle groups. Confidence interval, 99.97%. Vildorn had barely glanced at the readout. 14 cycles, practically a training exercise. He assigned it to Tactical Commander Sarathol, a young, ambitious officer who needed a simple conquest to pad his service record before being assigned to the real campaigns on the Outer Rim. The kind of mission where a commander could look competent without breaking a sweat. 2 battle groups, 47 warships, 90,000 Valdris assault troops, against one small, divided, primitive world. It should have been over before it started. The first signal came in on Cycle 3. Sarath-ul was reviewing extraction projections for the human northern continent when his communication officer, a pale-crested Valdris named Orveth, went unusually quiet at his station. Commander. Sarath-ul didn't look up. Report. The ground teams in Sector Ven have stopped transmitting. He looked up then. All of them? Yes, Commander. All 43 ground teams in Sector Ven simultaneously. Sarath-ul set down his data slate very slowly. 43 teams didn't go silent simultaneously from equipment failure. Last known transmission? Orveth's crest flattened, the Valdris equivalent of a deep frown. They were reporting routine pacification operations. Local resistance had been minimal. Then, he paused, his voice dropping half a register. Then one of them transmitted a single phrase before the signal cut. What phrase? Orveth looked at his commander with the expression of someone who very badly did not want to say the next words out loud. They're not running. The command bridge went very, very quiet. In 412 conquests, the Valdris ground forces had a universal experience. Every species, every civilization, every culture, when confronted with imperial assault troops, their technology, their numbers, their absolute ferocity, ran. It was not cowardice. It was biology. Every sentient species in the known galaxy had a survival mechanism that recognized an overwhelming predator and screamed escape. Every species had that mechanism. Sarath-ul stood up slowly from his command chair. Get me visual on Sector Ven. That's the other problem, Commander. Orveth's voice was barely above a whisper now. The orbital observation platforms over Sector Ven are also offline. Offline. Destroyed, sir. Something came up from the surface and destroyed them. But our sensors can't identify the launch signature. It doesn't match any human weapon system in our database. Sarath-ul stared at him. Any weapon system? Any system we have on record, Commander. Whatever took out those platforms, and we don't know what it is. The Supreme Commander of 2 Valdris battle groups stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the sector, and felt, for the first time in his decorated career, something cold move through his chest. He pulled up the intelligence dossier on Earth again. Read it from the beginning this time. Not skimming. Reading. His eyes stopped on a passage he had ignored the first time. A cultural note filed by a xenosociologist in the pre-invasion assessment team. The kind of soft science commentary that tactical commanders routinely dismissed. Note of interest. Humans are the only species in our survey catalog that has, at various points in their history, deliberately trained specific members of their population not to suppress their violent threat response, but to amplify it. They have cultural institutions, spanning thousands of years, dedicated to producing individuals in whom the survival flight instinct has been systematically inverted. These individuals do not run from danger. They have been conditioned, through processes that vary by culture and era, but share remarkable functional consistency, to move toward it. Furthermore, and this analyst considers this the most significant finding in the entire assessment, the humans do not consider this unusual. They celebrate it. They name these individuals, construct mythology around them, grant them status and resources. In every other species surveyed, such individuals would be classified as neurologically aberrant. Among humans, they are the ones placed in charge of defense. Recommendation: adjust confidence interval. This variable has not been adequately weighted. Sirath-ul read it twice. Then he opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vile Dorn. "Sir," he said, "I think we may have made an error." 3 weeks before the Valdris fleet entered Earth's solar system, a man named Marcus Hale was sitting in a classified briefing room somewhere beneath a mountain range that doesn't appear on any publicly available map. He was 38 years old. He had no social media presence, no public records past the age of 19, and 3 passports, all in different names. His file, had anyone outside the room been cleared to read it, contained a psychological evaluation that used the word anomalous 14 times in 11 pages. Across the table from him sat 11 other people. They did not look like soldiers. That was the first thing anyone who stumbled into that room by accident would have noticed. Soldiers have a particular kind of stillness, a discipline, a rigidity, a posture that speaks of hierarchy, absorbed into bone. The people in this room had stillness too, but it was a different kind entirely. The stillness of something that has stopped pretending. Their names in the official documentation were listed as unit designation, Chimera. 12 individuals drawn from programs that officially did not exist, recruited through channels that officially had never operated, trained in facilities that officially had never been built. The woman at the head of the table was Colonel Yara Vasquez. She had no official rank because her branch of service had no official name. What she had instead was 17 years of operational history in places where conventional military presence was considered too visible, too accountable, or too human. She looked around the table at the 11 people in front of her. "The Valdris Imperium," she said, "has conquered 412 worlds. Their invasion model assumes that every civilization they encounter will respond to overwhelming force the same way, with panic, fragmentation, and eventual collapse." She paused. That model has never failed. Nobody at the table said anything. They had been briefed on the fleet in orbit, the numbers, the firepower, the casualty projections if Earth attempted a conventional military response. They had all read the numbers. None of them looked particularly concerned. That, Vasquez reflected, was precisely why they were in this room. "Every nation contributing to this operation has submitted its best," she continued. "Special operations veterans, intelligence operatives, psychological warfare specialists, people who have spent careers learning to operate in environments where the expected response is not available to them." She let that sit for a moment. "The Valdris have a war model built on pattern recognition. They've seen hundreds of species. They've cataloged every possible variation of organized resistance." She looked around the table one more time. "They have never seen us." What the Valdris had not understood, what their war model had catastrophically failed to weight, was the specific product of human history. Most civilizations, when they developed warfare, developed it as an extension of territorial instinct. They built armies, hierarchies, systems of organized force that could be mapped, predicted, countered. The Valdris had conquered armies. They were very good at it. But humans had not only built armies. Over 10,000 years of recorded conflict, a small subset of humanity had gone somewhere else entirely. Not bigger armies, not more powerful weapons. Something stranger, more dangerous, and far harder to model. Call it what the recruiting files called it: asymmetric persistence, the capacity to continue operating, effectively, creatively, lethally, in conditions that would render conventional military units non-functional. No supply lines, no chain of command, no tactical certainty, no safe direction, no reliable intelligence, no reasonable expectation of survival. Not just tolerating those conditions, preferring them, because in chaos, pattern recognition-based war models stop working. And the people in that room had spent their entire careers learning to generate chaos. Corporal Jinsu Park had once spent 41 days alone behind enemy lines in a region without resupply, communications, or extraction possibility. and had come out the other side having completed his mission and, by his own account in the debrief, feeling clearer than he had in years. Sergeant Amara Osei had been captured twice by hostile forces. She had escaped both times, and neither facility had been functional afterwards. The psychological evaluation after the second incident had noted, with visible professional discomfort, that her stress cortisol levels during captivity had been lower than baseline. Warrant Officer Dmitry Varenkov communicated primarily through gesture and expression. When he did speak, it was in short declarative sentences. His evaluations contained phrases like, "does not experience threat stimuli in a normative fashion," and recommend further study before standard deployment. He had been in Chimera for 9 years. Lieutenant Seo Yeon Kwan had a doctorate in cognitive systems from a university she had never attended, in a name she no longer used. She had also, at some point in her career, talked her way out of 3 different execution orders using 3 different languages, one of which she had learned during the 48 hours preceding each incident, respectively. These were not extraordinary people by normal metrics. By normal metrics, several of them would have required significant intervention. But on a planet being approached by an alien empire with a 99.97% confidence interval, normal metrics were the least useful thing available. The Valdres made landfall on the European continent first. It was a strategic choice. Dense population, multiple centers of political power, high visibility. The kind of landing that broke morale. Imperial doctrine called it impression strike. Overwhelming force deployed in the most psychologically significant location to trigger cascading civilian panic and governmental collapse. It worked. It always worked. The human governments fractured exactly as projected. Emergency broadcasts, competing evacuation orders, political leaders contradicting each other. The civilian population flooded transport networks. Communications went to static in the targeted zones. The Dominion engine processed the data feeds and returned a satisfied status. Pacification, proceeding within projected parameters. The first 3 Valdres assault groups moved into the city centers. 48 hours of impression strike, then a broadcast offering surrender terms, generous by imperial standards, deliberately so because a fast capitulation was more efficient than prolonged resistance. 48 hours passed. The surrender broadcast went out. Silence. Not the silence of capitulation, not the silence of communication infrastructure collapse. The comms were working fine. The Valdres were monitoring them. The silence was human governments looking at each other and apparently deciding not to answer. Sarathul found this baffling. Run the behavioral model again. Already run, sir. Confidence interval unchanged. The projection indicates a response within the next 6 standard hours. They may simply need more time to organize the formal transmission. He nodded, waited. 6 hours later, the response came. Not from a government, not from a military command structure, from the ground, from inside the controlled zones. The assault team commander in the Brussels sector filed the report with shaking hands. Metaphorically speaking, since Valdres anatomy didn't quite work that way, but the behavioral equivalent was unmistakable. His name was Subcommander Vail Arak, and he had been on 11 pacification campaigns. He was not inexperienced. What had happened in the Brussels sector had no precedent in his 11 campaigns. His forces had established a perimeter, standard grid, every road in and out monitored. The local population had been contained in the central district, an efficient arrangement, familiar from a dozen other worlds. Then, over a period of approximately 6 hours, 17 of his soldiers had simply disappeared, not retreated from, not fled by, disappeared. No bodies, no evidence of engagement, no noise, no weapon signatures, no indication of a firefight. His men had been standing their posts, and then they had not been standing their posts, and there was nothing in between those 2 states that his sensors could detect. And then, and this was the part of the report that made Sarathul read it 3 times to make sure he had the translation correct. The humans had given them back. Not killed, not prisoners. Returned. Left at the perimeter. Alive. Unharmed. Except that every single one of them had been stripped of their weapons, their communications equipment, their tactical armor, and their unit identification. They had been returned in their underlayer clothing, disoriented, with no memory of the interval between disappearing and reappearing. And attached to the tunic of each returned soldier, in the Valdris written language, in characters precise enough to have been penned by someone who had studied it, was a single sentence, the same sentence, on all 17. We found your soldiers. We are returning them. Next time, we will not. Colonel Vasquez stood in a drainage tunnel beneath what had been, until 72 hours ago, an occupied city center. Around her, 11 people were doing various things with the quiet, unhurried focus of individuals who considered the current situation entirely manageable. Park was reassembling a piece of Valdris communications equipment with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the previous 4 hours learning to read alien firmware architecture. Quan was translating a Valdris tactical codebook she had acquired, the report didn't specify how, in the past 18 hours. Varenkov was asleep, deliberately and without apology, because he had a 4-hour window before his next operational tasking, and he used available time efficiently. Status, Vasquez said. Osei looked up from her position near the tunnel access. Asset network is operational in all 5 sectors. Contact established with 43 local civilian nodes. Supply corridor to the northern route is open. Their orbital scan frequency. Every 4 minutes, 11 seconds. We have mapped the blind spots. They're consistent. Their scanning protocol is standardized, not adaptive. Vasquez absorbed this. Of course it is. She said it not with contempt, but with something closer to professional recognition. 412 worlds, and it's always worked. No reason to make it adaptive. This was the thing that the Dominion engine had failed to calculate. Not the firepower, not the numbers, not even the specific individuals, remarkable as they were. The orientation. The Valdris built their war model on the assumption that every species when invaded was trying to stop the invasion. The natural, logical response to an overwhelming force was to find a way to match it, overpower it, push it back. That was not what Chimera was doing. They were not trying to win a war. They were not even trying to fight one in the conventional sense. They were trying to make the war unnavigable. Every move they made was designed not to destroy Valdris forces, but to destroy Valdris certainty. To take a war model built on pattern recognition and introduce so much noise, so much contradiction, so many variables that fell outside the predicted range, that the model simply stopped producing reliable outputs. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive and unharmed, told the Valdris nothing about what had happened to them. But it told them something far more destabilizing, that the enemy had decided to return them, which meant the enemy had made a choice, which meant the enemy was operating with a goal that wasn't immediately legible. An enemy you couldn't read was an enemy you couldn't model. And an enemy you couldn't model was the one thing in 412 campaigns the Valdris had never encountered. Sarath Ul called an emergency command council on Cycle 6. His senior commanders were arrayed around the tactical display, a holographic representation of the occupied zones, updated in real time with sensor data. From orbit, it looked controlled. The grid was maintained, the perimeters were holding, the civilian population was contained. But the data inside the perimeters was increasingly difficult to interpret. 17 additional soldiers missing from Sector Gamma, said his intelligence officer Subcommander Rethvalin. None recovered this time. No message, no indication of method. They were present at 0400, absent by 0600. The communications relay in Sector Delta? Destroyed. The replacement was destroyed within 40 minutes of installation. The secondary replacement was destroyed within 20 minutes. We have no communication capability in that sector. A pause. We also believe our channel encryption has been compromised, but we cannot confirm this because anything we transmit on that channel to confirm the compromise would itself be compromised. The food supply depot in Sector Vane? Rethvalin hesitated. Among the Valdris, hesitation was unusual. It indicated processing difficulty, a situation where available data was insufficient to produce a conclusion. The depot is functional, intact. However, we recommend against using it. Why? Another hesitation. Because we do not know how it remained intact. Everything around it in a 300-unit radius was damaged in the night operation. The depot itself was untouched, which is either an oversight on the part of the attackers, she paused, or it is not an oversight. Sarathul stared at the display. They left the food supply deliberately. We believe so. To make us uncertain whether it's safe. Yes. He looked at the hologram for a long time. Run a consumption risk analysis. Already done. The analysis indicates a 34% probability the depot has been compromised in some fashion. But the analysis is based on standard interference patterns, and these attackers have not been following standard patterns. Adjusting for unknown variables, the true probability range is between 12% and 71%. That's not an analysis, that's a shrug. Yes, Commander, it is. What the Valdris were experiencing had a name in human military theory. Vasquez had studied it for 20 years. It was older than any weapon system, older than any technology, as old as human conflict itself. Psychological attrition, not the destruction of an enemy's forces, the destruction of an enemy's will to continue, the systematic erosion of confidence, certainty, and the sense that the war was manageable. You couldn't fight what you couldn't find. You couldn't plan against what you couldn't predict. You couldn't maintain morale in forces that didn't know where the threat was coming from, how many there were, what they wanted, or what the rules of engagement were. The Valdris had landed 90,000 troops. Chimera had 12 people. And every single day, the Valdris war model diverged further from observed reality. On Cycle 9, a Valdris unit in the northern sector encountered something they filed as contact with hostile personnel, and then, in the same report, spent 6 paragraphs struggling to accurately describe. They had been moving through a cleared residential district. All civilians removed, all structures checked, all routes mapped. A standard patrol. They had done 100 of them since landing. They heard music, human music, a single instrument, something unfamiliar to them, melodic and unhurried, coming from inside a building they had cleared 6 hours prior. Doctrine said, investigate, suppress, report. 12 soldiers entered the building. The music stopped. 4 minutes later, 8 of the 12 came back out. The other 4 did not come out. The 8 who returned could not describe what had happened to the 4 who hadn't, not because they were being uncooperative, but because, as their debrief established beyond reasonable doubt, they genuinely did not know. They had been in the same room. The 4 had simply ceased to be present. But here was the part of the report that Sarath-ul read 4 times. The 8 who returned were, by every measurable metric, physically unharmed. But in the debrief, every one of them used the same unprompted phrase when asked to describe the experience. In 8 different soldiers, without coordination, in separate debrief sessions. They were watching us the whole time. Not we were attacked. Not they ambushed us. They were watching us the whole time. As if the entire patrol had been, from beginning to end, observed, studied. As if every Valdris soldier in that district had been walking through someone else's intelligence operation without knowing it. The psychological effect on the unit was not catalogued by any Valdris measurement system, because Valdris measurement systems did not have a category for it. What the unit had experienced, a human psychologist would have identified immediately. They had felt hunted. On Cycle 11, Sarathul did something no Valdris commander in 412 campaigns had ever done. He broadcast a request for direct communication, not surrender terms, not ultimatum. A request. He used the human linguistic databases captured in the first landing cycle, and he transmitted on every available frequency a message in 11 human languages. I wish to speak with your commanders. For 18 hours, there was no response. Then, on a frequency he hadn't transmitted on, a frequency that, according to his communications officer, his fleet was not currently monitoring, which meant whoever was transmitting it had known his scanning pattern well enough to find a gap in it. A single voice came through. Human, female, unhurried. You don't have commanders in your database for us. Sarath-ul leaned forward in his command chair. Then who am I speaking to? A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. The people your model didn't account for. I have become aware, he said carefully, that my operational projections were inaccurate. Yes. I would like to understand why. The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that he couldn't quite categorize. Not hostility, not gloating. Something more like a teacher with a student who had finally asked the right question. You built a model. 412 worlds. Every species in your catalog sent you their armies, their soldiers, people trained to fight, and also trained to stop fighting when the math stopped working, when the losses got too high, when the supplies ran out, when the chain of command fractured. Yes, Sarathul said. That is correct. We didn't send those people. He waited. Every species you've conquered has soldiers. They're the people a civilization builds to protect itself, trained to use force, but also trained to know when force isn't working, and to report that up the chain so someone can make a decision. Yes. We have those people too, we didn't send them. A pause. We sent the ones that don't report it up the chain, the ones that don't stop when the math stops working, the ones who have been specifically prepared over years for the condition you created. No supply lines, no communications, no tactical certainty, no clear chain of command. Operating inside an occupied zone against a technologically superior force. Sarath-ul said nothing. He was listening very carefully. You wanted a war. Your model told you what that would look like. You expected soldiers because every other species you've faced has sent soldiers. What you got instead was something your model has no category for. And what is that? The answer came without hesitation. People for whom this is normal. Sarathul sat with that for a long time after the channel closed. He pulled up the Dominion engine's original projection. Confidence interval, 99.97%. He looked at the assumptions embedded in that number. Every one of them logical. Every one of them drawn from a robust dataset. Every one of them assuming that the humans would respond to invasion the way every other species had. The Dominion engine didn't have a failure mode for an enemy that welcomed the conditions of asymmetric occupation. It had no category for combatants whose training was specifically designed for the exact scenario the Valdris had created. A populated zone, denied to conventional forces, with degraded communications and no clear front line. Because no species had ever sent those people. No species had ever had those people, or if they had recognized what they were, and put them specifically in charge of this. He opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vale Dorn. Sir. Report, Commander. Sir, I recommend immediate revision of the Dominion engine's assessment parameters for the human species. A pause. The engine shows pacification at 61% completion. The engine's data inputs are compromised, sir. We believe our communications have been monitored since Cycle 4. The 61% figure is based on controlled zone telemetry that may have been deliberately manipulated. A longer pause. Manipulated by whom? Their governments collapsed in Cycle 2. There is no command structure. That is correct, sir. There is no command structure. He paused. I believe that is the point. Part 5. The Reckoning, minutes 23 to 25. On Cycle 14, the day the Dominion engine had projected full pacification, the Valdris fleet received a transmission. Not from a government. Governments had indeed collapsed, just as projected. Not from a military command. There was no unified military command structure left on Earth, just as projected. The transmission came from one voice, on a frequency the Valdris had spent 11 days trying and failing to locate. Short, clear, in perfect standard Valdris, spoken by someone who had apparently learned the language in the past 2 weeks. You came to a world and expected to find what you've always found. You found something else. We're giving you a choice, a courtesy you didn't extend to the 412 worlds before us. Pause. Leave. Another pause, shorter. Your fleet, your forces, everything you brought. You have 72 hours. We will not interfere with your withdrawal. We will not fire on your ships. We will not pursue. And then, the sentence that made every Valdris officer who heard the transmission go very, very still. But if you are still here in 72 hours, we will stop being restrained. Sarathul looked at his command council. They looked back at him. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Because the thing that turned the transmission from a bluff into something else, something credible, something that sat in the chest like a cold stone, was everything that had happened in the previous 11 cycles. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive as a message. Soldiers disappearing from cleared zones with no trace. Patrols convinced they were being watched before anything happened. A food depot left intact specifically to be uncertain about. A communications frequency found in a gap in their own scanning pattern. All of it restrained. All of it calibrated. Every action designed not to maximize casualties, but to maximize psychological effect, which meant the people behind it were entirely capable of deciding what level of force to apply, which meant restrained was a real description, which meant what came after restrained was real too. Sarathul looked at the Dominion engine's current output. It had stopped producing confidence intervals 6 cycles ago. The data was too noisy. It was returning a status it had never returned in 412 campaigns. Insufficient pattern data, unable to project. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the fleet-wide command channel. All units, this is Commander Sarathul. Begin withdrawal protocols. They left in 61 hours, 11 hours ahead of the deadline. Nobody discussed that detail in the debrief. It wasn't the kind of thing Valdris commanders put in reports. Back on the human side, in a tunnel beneath a city that was just beginning to understand that the ships in orbit were moving, Colonel Vasquez looked at the sensor feed on a small captured Valdris display and watched the fleet begin to pull back. Nobody in the tunnel cheered. Nobody celebrated. Park looked up from the piece of equipment he was still out of what appeared to be pure professional interest, reverse engineering. Osei tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalculating something. Varenkov opened his eyes from his rest position, observed the display for exactly 3 seconds, and closed them again. Vasquez looked at the feed a moment longer, then she turned back to the room. When the last ship clears sensor range, she said, then we go home. Nobody argued with that. They waited. 3 months later, in a different part of the galaxy, Supreme Executor Vale Dorn was called before the Valdris High Command to explain the first failed pacification in the history of the Dominion. He brought the Dominion engine's final output, the sensor logs, every report from every ground commander. He laid it all out, methodically, in the precise and detailed manner of a man who had spent a long time understanding exactly what had happened and was not looking forward to explaining it. The High Command listened. When he was done, the eldest of them, a figure whose service record stretched back 100 years and spanned wars that had made the Valdris what they are, asked a single question. You're telling me we lost to 12 people? Vale Dorn considered the precise accuracy of that statement. No, sir, he said. We lost to what 12 people are. There's a difference. The elder looked at him for a long time. Update the engine, she said finally. Add a new category. What category? She looked at the planet's designation on the tactical display. The small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm. The young species. The divided civilization. The primitive weapons. Unprojectable, she said. And for the first time in the history of the Valdris Dominion, a world in their catalog was marked not as pacified, not as pending, not as contested, but as do not engage. Somewhere in a tunnel beneath a rebuilding city, a woman with no public records and 3 passports read the final intelligence report, confirming the Valdris had left the solar system entirely. She set it down. She made coffee. The war, if it had ever really been a war, was over. It had lasted 14 cycles. Just like the engine predicted, for entirely the wrong reasons. The message arrived at 0300 hours Universal Standard Time, beamed simultaneously to every government terminal, military satellite, and deep space relay station humanity had ever built. It bypassed every firewall, every encryption protocol, Every security layer the United Earth Defense Network had spent 40 years constructing. It simply appeared, the way a god's voice might appear, without invitation, without warning, without apology. The text was brief, brutally so. To the species designate, human, the Galactic Sovereignty Council, governing body of 412 recognized civilizations spanning the Orion Cygnus arm, hereby issues the following declaration. Your species has been found in violation of Sovereignty Accord 7 Theta, subsection 9, paragraph 3. The unauthorized militarization of a contested stellar corridor. The corridor known to your people as the Kepler Transit Lane has been under sovereignty jurisdiction for 11,000 years. Your construction of 17 military installations along its length constitutes an act of aggression under galactic law. You are given 24 standard hours to transmit your unconditional surrender, decommission all installations, and submit your species leadership for judgment before the Council. Failure to comply will result in the total pacification of your home system. This is not a negotiation. This is not a warning. This is your only notice. Admiral Sarah Voss read the message 4 times. Then she set down her coffee, still hot, still perfectly black, the way she always took it, and stared at the wall of her office aboard UES Resolute, humanity's largest dreadnought, currently parked in high orbit above Earth's moon. She had been in command for 11 years. She had fought the Cathari border skirmishes. She had survived the Void Plague. She had watched 3 of her closest friends die in the silent dark between stars. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a person who frightened easily. She was frightened now, not because of the message itself. Voss was a military woman. She understood threats, she understood ultimatums, she understood the language of force. What frightened her was something far more specific. The message had been received by every human being simultaneously, on every device in every corner of human-occupied space. That kind of reach, that kind of casual, effortless penetration of humanity's most sophisticated systems, spoke not of a civilization that was powerful. It spoke of a civilization for whom power was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that displaying it required no effort at all. She opened a secure channel to Earth. Secretary General Harlan Osei answered on the second ring. He looked exactly the way she felt, gray-faced, hollow-eyed, the kind of calm that only people who have stopped being afraid of the worst-case scenario can achieve. You've seen it, he said. It wasn't a question. I've seen it, she confirmed. How long has Command known about violations in the Kepler corridor? A pause. Too long. The kind of pause that said, longer than they should have. 18 months, Osei said quietly. The installations were classified under Project Threshold, deep space forward positions, defensive technically. Technically, Voss repeated. She let the word sit in the air like a stone dropped into still water, watching the ripples. And no one thought to inform the Council? No one thought to check whether we were building inside someone else's territory? The stellar surveys indicated the corridor was unclaimed, Osei said. Our cartographers cross-referenced every known sovereignty map in the galactic database. 11,000 years, Voss interrupted. They've held that corridor for 11,000 years. That's 3 times older than recorded human civilization. Our surveys didn't find it because we weren't looking for something that old. Another silence. Outside the viewport, Earth turned slowly, blue and white and achingly beautiful, the way it always looked from up here. The way it had always made her chest tighten with something that sat between pride and terror. 24 hours, Osei said. What do we do with 24 hours? Voss thought about it. Not for long. The answer was already there, the way the answers always were. Not comfortable, not clean, but present. We don't surrender, she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Sarah. I'm not saying we fight them, she continued, her voice steady in the way that only fear, when it has been thoroughly processed and converted into something useful, can produce. I'm saying we don't surrender. There's a difference. And I need you to trust me on that difference for the next 24 hours because what I'm about to propose is either the most brilliant thing humanity has ever done or the last. She pulled up a holographic display. 17 installations. The Kepler Transit Lane. 412 civilizations. A clock ticking. 23 hours and 51 minutes remaining. She started making calls. The first call was to Dr. Una Park, humanity's leading xenolinguist, and the woman who had spent 30 years studying every scrap of galactic law ever leaked, stolen, or diplomatically obtained. Park answered from her office at the University of New Geneva, dressed in pajamas, her hair loose and her expression carrying the particular alertness of a person who had been awake for hours, already chewing on the same problem. "I've been waiting for your call," Park said without preamble. "I've been reading the accord." "And?" Voss asked. Park smiled. It was a small smile, precise and careful, the kind of smile that carried a loaded weapon inside it. "And," she said, "I think the Council may have made a mistake." The second call was to General Tobias Mwangi, commander of the Kepler installations themselves, a blunt, boulder-shaped man who had spent his career building things in places other people called impossible. He answered from Installation 7, the largest of the 17, a station the size of a small city carved into the rock of a rogue asteroid at the corridor's midpoint. "They want me to decommission," he said before Voss could speak. "I heard the message. Everyone heard the message." "Don't touch a single bolt," Voss said. Mwangi looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face of a man who had been told many things over the course of a long career, many of them dangerous, many of them stupid, occasionally both at once. He had a gift for telling the difference. "Understood," he said, and nothing else. The third call was to Captain Liu Shen, commanding officer of UES Pathfinder, currently the fastest ship in the human fleet. A sleek, needle-thin vessel built for reconnaissance, designed to go places and come back before anyone noticed. Shen was 29 years old, absurdly talented, and constitutionally incapable of following an order he thought was wrong, which made him simultaneously humanity's best officer and its most exhausting one. "I need you at coordinates I'm transmitting now," Voss said. "Maximum speed. You'll be carrying Dr. Park." Shen glanced at the coordinates. His eyebrows rose. "That's the edge of the sovereignty's nearest administrative sector," he said. "Yes." "That's inside their space." "Yes." "Admiral, if they see us as aggressive—" "They already see us as aggressive," Voss said. "That's not the variable I'm managing. Get moving." 22 hours and 30 minutes remaining. In the council chamber 11 billion kilometers away, the 17 members of the Galactic Sovereignty Council watched the human response, or rather, the absence of one, with a mixture of contempt and mild interest. Contempt, because silence was what small civilizations always produced in the first hours after an ultimatum. Interest, because sometimes those silences meant something. High Arbiter Velsharath, the oldest and most powerful member of the Council, studied the human stellar map with the particular attention of someone who found insects fascinating, precisely because their lives were so brief. "They have not responded," said Councillor Drath of the Merkethi Collective, a species that communicated through bioluminescent pulses and regarded all verbal language as a sign of evolutionary immaturity. "They will," said Velsharath. "They always do. The small ones always want to believe there is something to say." "Should we be concerned about their military capacity?" asked Councillor Pren of the Yas Federation, a being that resembled, from certain angles, a 6-meter column of amber smoke. Velsharath considered the question with the patience of someone for whom consideration cost nothing. "Their largest vessel masses approximately 40,000 tons, he said. "Our lightest patrol cruiser masses 300,000. Their most advanced weapon system, the so-called Helix cannon, generates approximately 12 terajoules of focused energy. Our standard infantry sidearm generates 9. He paused. "No. We are not concerned." The chamber settled back into quiet satisfaction. None of them were watching Dr. Park. None of them yet knew they should be. UES Pathfinder crossed into sovereignty space at hour 6, running dark. No transponder, no active sensors. Nothing that would read as a military approach on any standard detection grid. Shen flew it the way he flew everything. With the quiet intensity of a man conducting surgery, every adjustment micro-precise, every calculation made 3 moves ahead. Dr. Park sat in the co-pilot seat and read. She had been reading for 6 hours. The full text of Sovereignty Accord 7 Theta, the annexes, the supplementary protocols, the historical precedents, the 11,000 years of case law that the Council had accumulated in their long administration of the Orion Cygnus arm. She read the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, not looking for what was there, but for what was missing. She found it at hour 7. There, she said quietly and pointed at a line of text so old it had been rendered in a script that predated the modern galactic standard by 4,000 years. Shen glanced at it. "I can't read that," he said. "No," Park agreed. "Almost no one can. It took me 3 years to learn this dialect." She leaned back in her seat. "It says, sovereignty claim upon any stellar corridor, lane, or passage shall be considered valid and enforceable only in the event that said claim has been continuously and demonstrably maintained through active administrative presence, as defined in Schedule C, throughout the period of claim." Shen stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," Park said, "that you can't just claim a corridor and walk away for 11,000 years. You have to maintain it. Actively, administratively. There have to be records, regular patrols, registered vessels, administrative filings, the galactic equivalent of paying your property taxes." She tapped the text. Schedule C defines active administrative presence as a minimum of 1 registered vessel transiting the corridor per standard year, with logged records submitted to the Sovereignty Archive. "And the Kepler corridor?" Shen asked slowly. Park's smile returned, that same precise loaded smile. "Has not had a single registered vessel transited in 412 years, she said. "I pulled the Sovereignty Archive records myself 6 hours ago. The last logged patrol was filed under a civilization called the Vath Principality, which ceased to exist in year 7203 of the Sovereignty calendar, when it was absorbed by the Merkethi Collective." She paused. "Who have never filed a single corridor maintenance record in the 400 years since." Shen was quiet for a long moment. "So the claim is void," he said. "Under their own law," Park said. "The claim has been void for 412 years, which means when humanity built those installations, we weren't building in contested territory. We were building in unclaimed space, which is explicitly permitted under Sovereignty Accord 3D Alpha, the right of frontier settlement, which every recognized civilization, including humanity, ratified when we were granted observer status in the galactic community 30 years ago. We're allowed to be there. We were always allowed to be there. The Council either doesn't know their own law, or—" She paused. "Or they know and they don't care," Shen said. "Or they know and they don't care," Park agreed. "Because for 412 civilizations, the law is something that applies to the small ones, not to them. The silence between them carried the particular weight of a realization that changes the shape of everything that comes after it." "Where are we going?" Shen asked, though he already knew. "The Sovereignty Archive," Park said. "I need certified copies of everything, logged, stamped, and submitted to the Council's own legal record system before hour 24. Because if we're going to win this, and we are going to win this, we're going to win it the right way. Their way, with their law, their records, their own 11,000-year paper trail pointing straight back at them." She looked at the coordinates ahead. The archive was a station the size of a small moon, orbiting a red dwarf star at the edge of the Sovereignty's administrative core. It was staffed by a species called the Kelfari, ancient librarians who had been maintaining galactic records since before humanity had discovered fire, and who were, famously, legendarily, incorruptible. Not because they were noble. Because they simply didn't care about anything except the records. The records were everything, the records were sacred. "Will they let us in?" Shen asked. "Humanity is an observer civilization," Park said. "Under Accord 2 Beta, Observer civilizations have full archive access rights. She paused. The Council has never revoked our observer status, because to do so, they would have had to file the revocation with the archive, and filing anything with the archive creates a permanent record, and they didn't want a permanent record of what they were doing. Shen considered this. They outsmarted themselves, he said. Civilizations that have been powerful for 11,000 years, Park said quietly, sometimes forget what it was like to need the rules. They stop reading the fine print. They stop checking the schedules. They assume the law is what they say it is. She looked out the viewport at the cold blaze of alien stars. They forgot that the law is also what's written down. Back on Earth, Admiral Voss was managing the other half of the equation, the military half. Not because she intended to fight, she was not so far gone from reason as that, but because the Council needed to believe, for the next 17 hours, that humanity might. Because a species that simply accepted an ultimatum was a species that could be issued another one and another and another, until there was nothing left to surrender but the habit of standing. She pulled the fleet, not to the Kepler corridor. That would have been provocation, and provocation was not the tool she needed. She pulled every available UED vessel to the edge of Sol System's outer boundary, forming a loose perimeter that was, by any reasonable military calculus, absurd. 47 ships against the sovereignty's thousands. 47 ships that massed in aggregate, approximately what the Council's smallest patrol cruiser massed alone. She wasn't building a wall. She was building a statement. The statement was, we are still here. We have not flinched. We have not moved. The clock is running and we are still, calmly, exactly where we were. Councillor Drath of the Merkethi Collective was the first to notice. They have not decommissioned, Drath said, their bioluminescent pulses cycling through colors that translated roughly as irritation. They have not responded. They have not retreated. They have moved their vessels to their system boundary. Posturing, said Velsharath with the serenity of someone who had watched 1,000 small civilizations posture and break. Perhaps, said Drath, but one of their vessels has crossed into our space. A small ship. Fast. Running dark. Velsharath turned. His attention, when it fully engaged, was like a searchlight. Blinding, absolute, slightly terrifying even to his colleagues. Where? He said. Heading for the archive, said Drath. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable silences that had preceded it. This one had edges. Why? Said Velsharath, very slowly. Would they be going to the archive? No one answered. Because no one knew. Because for 412 years no one had needed to know. Velsharath pulled up the text of Sovereignty Accord 7 Theta. He read it. Then he read Schedule C. He was very still for a very long time. How long since a vessel transited the Kepler corridor under Sovereignty Registry? He asked very quietly. His aide checked. The aide's color changed, not the bioluminescence of the Merkethi, but the particular gray-white pallor of a being who has just realized something terrible. 412 years, High Arbiter. The council chamber had never been so quiet. 13 hours and 40 minutes remaining. The Kelfari did not speak. They communicated through movement, the precise, deliberate repositioning of their 6 limbs in patterns that had been formalized over 40,000 years of archival practice. To an untrained observer, they looked like very large, very slow spiders engaged in an elaborate interpretive dance. To someone who knew the language, and Park did because Park knew every language that had ever been written down, they were saying, proceed to Terminal 7, present your credentials, state your request. Pathfinder docked at hour 9. Park moved through the archive with the focused efficiency of someone who has spent their entire professional life preparing for exactly this moment without knowing it. The archive was vast, a structure so large that its interior had its own weather system, currents of climate-controlled air moving between towers of storage medium that stretched from floor to ceiling for kilometers in every direction. Records going back 40,000 years. Every treaty, every accord, every administrative filing, every patrol log, every border adjustment, Every territorial claim that had ever been submitted to the galactic sovereignty, every gap, every lapse, every 400-year silence in a record that was supposed to speak every year. Park found Terminal 7, presented her credentials. Observer Civilization Representative, United Earth Government, authorized under Accord 2 Beta, and made her request. The Kelfari at the terminal processed it, checked the credentials, cross-referenced the accord, checked again. Then they began to move, and their movement said, "This request is valid. Proceed." What followed was 3 hours of the most consequential archival research in human history, conducted in near silence in a terminal alcove deep in the body of the archive, surrounded by 40,000 years of accumulated record. Park pulled the Kepler corridor maintenance logs. All of them. Every year, every decade, every century, going back to the original Vath Principality claim of year 2088. Regular filings through year 6091. Annual patrols, logged and certified. Then, year 6792, nothing. Year 6793, nothing. 412 consecutive years of nothing. She pulled the Schedule C definition of administrative maintenance. She pulled the Accord 7 Theta validity clause. She pulled the Accord 3 Alpha frontier settlement rights. She pulled the Observer Civilization ratification records for humanity, signed and certified in year 11403 of the sovereignty calendar, 32 years ago. She built the argument the way she would have built any argument. From the ground up, every stone placed with precision, every joint mortared with citation and cross-reference, and the kind of obsessive logical rigor that had made her, over 30 years of scholarship, simultaneously the most brilliant and most infuriating person in any room she occupied. Then she filed it. Not with the council, with the archive itself. The archive was the sovereignty's permanent record. Filing with the archive meant the document existed, permanently, indelibly, irrevocably, regardless of what the council did or said afterward. It meant that when future civilizations, centuries from now, looked back at this moment, they would find humanity's argument in its entirety, sitting in the record, demanding to be read. The Kelfari stamped it, logged it, assigned it a case number, Case 11447H. The first human-initiated legal challenge in galactic sovereignty history. Then, because the archive's protocols required notification of all parties in any filed dispute, they transmitted a copy to the council. It arrived at hour 12. Bel-Sharath read it in his private chambers, alone, which was unusual. He read it twice, which was more unusual still. He was not a being who needed to read things twice. The argument was airtight. He had known this was possible, in the abstract way that one knows a structural flaw exists in a building without ever expecting anyone to find it. He had known because he was old and careful and thorough beings always know where their vulnerabilities are. But knowing a vulnerability exists and having someone find it and file it in the permanent record are very different things. The council had 2 options. Option 1. Proceed with the pacification order. Destroy the human installations. Potentially destroy Earth itself, as the ultimatum had implied. Win the military engagement, which was not in doubt, was never in doubt. And lose the legal argument permanently, on the record, for every civilization in the sovereignty to see. Establish a precedent that the council could and would violate its own accords when it suited them, and that a small civilization that found the right clause and filed the right document could be destroyed for it. Watch what happened to the sovereignty's authority, carefully accumulated over 11,000 years, when 412 civilizations started checking their own archives for gaps. Option 2. Acknowledge the filing, acknowledge the argument, acknowledge that the Kepler corridor claim had lapsed, that humanity's installations were legal, that the ultimatum had been issued in error, which it had been, technically, if anyone was being rigorous about it, and the Kelfari were always rigorous, and withdraw. Bel-Sharath sat with the options for a long time. He was 11,000 years old, in the way that beings of his species measured such things. He had watched civilizations rise and collapse, had watched ideologies burn bright and gutter out, had watched species that had seemed permanent as stone crumble to dust. He had learned over that long span the difference between the things that could be recovered from and the things that could not. Losing a legal argument could be recovered from. Losing 11,000 years of accumulated legitimacy could not. He opened a channel to his senior aide. "Contact Admiral Voss," he said. "I wish to speak with her directly." His aide stared at him. "High Arbiter, our vessels are positioned. The pacification fleet is at the boundary of the human system." "One word." "One word," Bel-Sharath agreed. "And we destroy a small civilization that was, by every measure of our own law, building legally in unclaimed space. And we hand every resentful civilization in the sovereignty the proof they've been waiting for that we operate above the law." He paused. "Contact Admiral Voss." 11 hours remaining. Voss was on the bridge of Resolute when the channel opened. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She had consumed approximately 12 cups of coffee, and she did not, at this precise moment, look like someone who had spent the last 13 hours in a state of controlled terror. She looked like someone who had expected this call. Bel-Sharath studied her through the view screen. He had dealt with many species in his long career. He had dealt with warriors and diplomats and kings and warlords and beings for whom the concept of individual identity was so alien that conversation required dedicated interpretation software. He had a gift for reading beings. He read Voss. He saw behind the stillness, behind the control, the faintest ghost of something that might have been, not triumph, not yet, but the recognition of a door opening that had been locked. "Admiral Voss," he said. "High Arbiter," she replied. "You are aware of the filing made by your representative at the Sovereignty Archive." "I am." "You understand that this does not change the fundamental reality of your situation." "I understand," Voss said, "that the fundamental reality of our situation is that we were building legally in unclaimed space, that your ultimatum was issued in error, and that the archive now has a permanent record of both those facts." Another silence. This one different again. Not comfortable, not alarmed, but considering. "You are a very small civilization," Bel-Sharath said. "You have been recognized by the sovereignty for 32 years. You have, in that time, mapped approximately 0.003% of the territory we administer. You have a single inhabited homeworld, 6 colony stations, and 17 military installations that are, I will acknowledge this, technically legal, under a reading of our accords that no one has applied in 4,000 years. He paused. "And yet here we are." "Here we are," Voss agreed. "I find," Bel-Sharath said slowly, "that I am curious about your species." "That's a start," Voss said. The final 11 hours were not what anyone expected. Not the Council, who had expected either submission or futile defiance. Not the watching civilizations. And there were many of them watching, because word had spread through the sovereignty's communication networks with the speed of something that everyone had been quietly waiting to see, who had expected either a spectacular destruction or a humiliating capitulation. Not even Voss herself, who had expected a negotiation and got instead something stranger and more consequential. She got a conversation. Bel-Sharath talked to her for 9 hours. Not to negotiate. The legal argument was settled. The archive had spoken, and the High Arbiter was nothing if not a being who understood finality. He talked to her the way a very old scholar might talk to a student who had, unexpectedly, demonstrated the kind of insight that makes the scholar revise their opinion of the student entirely. He asked about Earth, about the Kepler installations, what they were for, what humanity was building toward, what the next 100 years looked like from inside the most junior observer civilization in the sovereignty's history. He asked about Dr. Park, whose name was already circulating in the Council's internal channels with an appended notation that translated roughly as someone to watch. He asked about the coffee. Voss, who had been nursing her 14th cup, looked at it, looked at him, and answered honestly. He processed the description of caffeine dependency with the focused interest of a being who had not encountered the concept before and found it unexpectedly relatable. In the Sovereignty Archive, Dr. Park was still working. Not on the legal challenge, no, that was filed, stamped, permanent. She was working on something else. A comprehensive survey of every lapsed territorial claim in the sovereignty's recorded history, cross-referenced against unclaimed space in the regions where humanity currently operated. It was the kind of work that would take years to complete properly, but the outline was already visible, and the outline was remarkable. There were 47 lapsed claims, 47 corridors, sectors, and stellar zones where the sovereignty's administrative presence had faltered or ceased, where the maintenance records had gone quiet, where the law, their law, the law they had written and stamped and filed 11,000 years ago, had silently voided claims that no one had bothered to re-examine. Park filed a preliminary survey with the archive, not as a legal challenge, as an academic document, the kind of thing a researcher files, the kind of thing that goes into the record without necessarily triggering any specific action, the kind of thing that simply exists available for anyone who wants to look. The Kelfari stamped it, logged it, filed it under Park, Y, Human Civilization, Frontier Survey, Lapsed Sovereignty, Administrative Claims in the Orion Arm, Preliminary Report. It would be read by 600 beings within the hour, 6,000 within the day. At hour 22, the Council issued a revised statement. It was careful language, the kind of language that says something significant while technically admitting to nothing. The Kepler corridor claim was under administrative review. The ultimatum was suspended pending legal clarification. The pacification fleet was repositioned for routine patrol duties. The clock reached 0. Humanity had not surrendered. The installation stood. Earth turned, blue and white and achingly intact in the light of its unremarkable yellow star. On the bridge of UES Resolute, Admiral Voss set down her 15th cup of coffee and looked out at the moon, and the stars beyond it, and the vast dark between them that her species had barely begun to cross. She thought about Dr. Park, 11 billion kilometers away in an archive the size of a moon, building a map of everything they were allowed to reach. She thought about General Mwangi in Installation 7, surrounded by 17 platforms of steel and purpose that were, it turned out, exactly where they were supposed to be. She thought about the conversation with Vel Sharath, which had ended an hour ago with a formality that she had recognized even through the translation software as something approaching respect. The old arbiter's parting words had been, "Your species is young. Young species are dangerous because they have not yet learned what cannot be done." Voss had thought about that for a while. Then she had said, "With respect, High Arbiter, we're not dangerous because we don't know what can't be done. We're dangerous because we keep checking." Another long silence. And then, from a being 11,000 years old, presiding over 412 civilizations, commanding a fleet that could sterilize a planet from orbit without breaking a sweat. "Yes," Vel Sharath had said. "I see that." Secretary General Osei called at hour 24, minute 0. He looked different from the gray-faced man she had spoken to 24 hours ago. Not relaxed. There was too much still unresolved for relaxed, but present, grounded. The look of a man who has come to terms with the fact that the universe is large and strange and does not, fundamentally, care about the comfort of its inhabitants, and who has decided that this is not a reason to stop standing. "It held," he said. "It held," Voss confirmed. Park's filing changes everything, Voss said. "Not today, not next year. But the preliminary survey she filed, 47 lapsed claims. That's going to be read, it's going to be studied. Every junior civilization in the sovereignty that's ever felt squeezed by a territorial decision they couldn't challenge is going to read that document and look at their own maps and start checking their own archives." She paused. "We didn't just defend the Kepler corridor. We handed the entire sovereignty a mirror." Osei was quiet for a moment. "Is that a good thing?" he asked. Voss thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "It's a true thing. Whether it's good depends on what everyone does with it." She looked at Earth. "But I know this. The Council gave us 24 hours to surrender, and the clock ran out, and we're still here. And the next civilization they try this with, whether it's us or someone else, they're going to remember that. That someone checked, Osei said quietly. That someone checked, Voss agreed. 3 weeks later, the Sovereignty Council issued a formal administrative notice to all member and observer civilizations. All territorial claims within the sovereignty would undergo a comprehensive review of administrative maintenance records. Any claims found to have lapsed under Schedule C provisions would be flagged for resolution. The review was expected to take 20 years. It was the largest administrative undertaking in sovereignty history. It had been triggered by a single human archivist one sleepless night, reading the fine print in a 4,000-year-old document that no one had looked at closely in centuries. Dr. Park was offered a position on the review committee, the first human ever appointed to a sovereignty administrative body. She accepted on the condition that her full research team came with her, and that humanity received full access to the archive for the duration. The council agreed. General Mwangi built Installation 18. Captain Shen was promoted, mostly because Voss couldn't think of a better way to manage him than to give him more responsibility and see what he did with it. He exceeded expectations, because he always did. And Admiral Sarah Voss, on the morning after the clock ran out, finally slept. 8 hours, uninterrupted, dreamless, the sleep of someone who has done the thing they needed to do and can, for a moment, set it down. She woke to a message from Velsharath. It contained no words. Just a data file, a copy of Sovereignty Accord 7 Theta, Schedule C, with a single notation appended in the High Arbiter's own administrative code. The notation said, amended. Maintenance requirement increased to quarterly filing. Below it, in the same code, as recommended by Human Observer Representative Park, Y effective immediately. Voss read it twice. Then she got up, made coffee, and went back to work. There was a lot of space left to check.